rents may in fact be more than 30% of the tenant's income. The goal, of course, is to achieve 30% of the income, but the full rent is the responsibility of that tenant, and they may in fact end up having to pay a little bit more. So examples of that are a lot of your newer projects within Bozeman. So it's going to be something like Stone Ridge or Larkspur or the West Babcock Apartments. And so where this sort of falls, so when we're talking subsidized and rent restricted, who are we kind of talking about? So if I take somebody who has a disability benefit, they're going to earn less than $10,000 per year. Their affordable rent's $235 a month. That is somebody who needs a subsidized rental in order to actually be able to make their rent payment and have any money for anything else. Even, the average senior who comes to HRDC for assistance is earning just a couple $1,000s a year more than that. So their average rent that they could pay and be affordable is about $288 a month. And I go all the way through this to a household of two, so the average Bozeman household size at 60% of area median income in Bozeman. They can pay about $1,000 a month. That's an annual income of $43,000 a year. And that's really kind of where you're starting to look at your rent restricted targets. This compares to the Bozeman Housing Needs Assessment. They did a 1-month study of available units. There were about 140 units that came up for rent during that time, and their average price was $1,570 a month. So you can see there is a huge difference between rent restricted rentals and average Bozeman rentals. And then there's still a big difference between a rent restricted rental and what a person on fixed income might be able to afford. And so where does this kind of live on our housing continuum, on our housing bridge here in Bozeman? So I look at supportive and subsidized housing is at the bottom. And I think that this is near the emergency shelter and transitional housing, because without adequate subsidized housing, these are the folks that are most likely to fall into homelessness or be in danger of losing their homes. Then we move up a little bit and we're into subsidized housing. And again, if you don't have enough supply, these are the folks that are going to be the most crunched. I think that Harvard's Joint, I can't think of the name of it, Joint Center for Housing Studies has demonstrated that we are seeing more and more middle and higher income renters who are overpaying for their rent. So this is putting further squeeze on folks at the lower end of the housing continuum. Then when we're looking below 60% AMI, that's where we're starting to talk about rent restricted, deed restricted, low income housing tax credit. And then finally, as you move up, I put a final circle on there for the city's affordable housing ordinance, because it's really serving families are at that 80% and lower mark. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff to talk a little bit about subsidized housing and the alphabet soup of programs and kind of the 30,000-foot view of how subsidized housing works and why it's important to our community.
Absolutely. So if I get a little sidetracked, definitely reel me back in. But there's a definition above of subsidized housing. So the residents are paying 30% of their income to the rent, which is obviously significantly under the rent restricted rents or market, of course. So there's Section 8, which is kind of the typical known HUD Section 8 contract, which a lot of times has 5-year, 10-year, or 20-year contract terms. They're annually renewed, and or you get new rent every year based upon a OCAF, which is an operating cost adjustment factor. That said, there's other programs that are subsidized, but they only have annual term contracts. So that's under the mod rehab, as you see on this slide, and that's under a program called RAD, Rental Assistance Demonstration. So there's something called RAD 1, which is public housing authorities own public housing projects, which are all subsidized, but they get an annual contract from HUD for operating and rent subsidies. It's a similar subsidy whereby the resident still only pays 30% of their income, but the housing authority is only getting money on an annual basis, and for that reason, they can't do any sort of financing, they can't leverage the property because no lender will lend on an annual contract because they're not guaranteed that income will be coming to the properties to pay the debt service. The reason I'm talking about that is that there's studies where throughout the country, the needed capital improvements and deferred maintenance repairs is the amount, upwards of $30 billion of improvements needed in these public housing assets. And that solidifies and highlights the issue with annual contracts. And so to bring it closer to home, the Boulevard here in Bozeman is under RAD 2, which is called a moderate rehab contract. And that is an annually renewing contract with no long-term use restriction currently on the project. So obviously when HRDC stepped up and got it, they were preserving that in the long term. And through the money afforded by the Housing Trust Fund and the City of Bozeman and this LIHTC process we're going through, we'll be able to renovate it and through the RAD program convert to a 20-year housing assistance payment contract, HAP contract, which is a HUD contract, starting next year. So there'll be a HUD use restriction on that in the long term. We'll have a 55-year low-income housing tax credit use restriction. So we are solidifying that as affordable in perpetuity, obviously, as hopeful. So to reference that, typical preservation of existing developments using LIHTC. So when we approach these subsidized programs, in order to do the necessary repairs, we will go to HUD and get a 20-year HAP contract. And I know we haven't talked much about the low-income housing tax credit program, but basically there's a 15-year term which you have to be, you have to maintain compliance in 15 years. So when a lender and a tax credit investor come in, they'll require at least 15-year HUD contracts on these subsidized programs. Obviously, we go for 20 years where we can, just to solidify that income stream for the debt. And I don't want to get ahead on the LIHTC stuff, but basically the assumption there is after the 15-year compliance period, we'll refinance the properties again, do the necessary improvements, and so the immediate conversion and the LIHTC transaction is to get these properties in shape and fully up to standard for the next 15 to 20 years, whereby after that 15-year mark, we'll do it again and renovate the property. But something important to note, obviously, the residents are only paying 30% of their income currently at Boulevard, and they'll continue to do that. The program might be different in terms of the umbrella, but the subsidized definition and requirements of 30% of their income is remains. And so you'll see on one of these noted items by Tracy, the HUD mod rehab annual contract, high risk of market conversion, and I think the Boulevard is obviously that example where if that was sold on the open market, there were no deed restrictions on the property, so somebody could convert it immediately to market rate and do as they please. So we put long-term use restrictions both on the HUD side and the LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit side as well. And I think
Geoff, would you talk a little bit about why you can't necessarily just pack up those vouchers and move them? I think that was a question people had a lot about the Boulevard as well.
The project-based versus tenant-based?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, so there are kind of different flavors of subsidies. There are tenant-based vouchers, which individuals can have a voucher and they go to other rental complexes and try to rent units out by using the voucher that is subsidized. So they pay 30% and HUD pays the other portion. The Boulevard and these other properties in Bozeman are project-based vouchers, whereby the entire project has a voucher contract on a per unit basis. So individuals and residents can come and go, but the unit is always income restricted and always receives that subsidy for the term of the contract. And after 20 years, it's always assumed, and you get a new 20-year contract at that point. So they're project based, and so the contracts don't move. And obviously that's a benefit for the property in the long term. And in general, subsidized programs, it's very seldom to get project-based subsidies. So similar to the Boulevard, if that went away, you wouldn't get a new subsidized contract for 39 or 41 units. They're very hard to get. So any Section 8, USDA, RD, anything like that is important to keep in place and preserve.
Thanks, Geoff.
Anything else?
Before we move to the next slide, Heather, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on subsidized programs before we move over to rent restricted.
I don't have a lot to add. It's actually really hard to sit on my hands and not talk, but I think Geoff handled it and did the appropriate level. But when you do flip to the next slide, I'm going to jump to the last bullet and try to build on what he said. So go ahead and switch gears.
Okay, I'm sorry. My dog is angry, so you may hear her.
It's all good. So what I do want to do is literally go to the last bullet, and I'll come back and I'll talk about all the programs. Don't worry, but when you have the different color words and it says preservation is important, but slightly less critical than, and the things came across, subsidized. Subsidized, those are rare unicorn projects. They are with subsidy attached. The preservation of those with the rental assistance is absolutely critical because, as Geoff said, they will go, if they leave, they will be gone and we'll never get them back. And in Montana, we're fighting an uphill battle on that and making sure that we prioritize those projects. So I do want to put a nod to that and then jump back up and I'll explain why. This is a very large topic. So when we talk rent restriction, we liked that, we call it the cycle of housing or the spectrum that Tracy illustrated, but rent restricted is going up to that next bandwidth that you're talking about. And the most common term you'll hear would be the low-income housing tax credit. Our state likes to call it the housing tax credit, but basically what it means is that it is a program from the IRS. The IRS allocates, there's federal credits, and those federal credits are allocated to every state based on their population. And these are 9% low-income housing tax credits. And I'm going to talk about why they're so important, but also what they do. Is those credits are allocated. In Montana, we have the lowest population, smallest, so we get the lowest. So we get enough credits from the feds to the state. Then we compete for those every year, all of us, for the different projects, for preservation and for new construction, and for every community in Montana. Every year there's probably about 25 letters of intent, 8 people get asked to apply and maybe 5 get funded. And so it's a very finite resource and very important because what that program does is it creates a relationship with an equity partner, and the equity can be between 70 and 80% of the total project costs, and it's equity. And so it's a really great program because what it does is I like to say it's bipartisan, if you want to look at it that way, but basically we're allocated credits for a project. We develop the project and use their money up front. And then what we do is we tie ourselves to that equity investor, as Geoff said, for 15 years. That investor gets a tax credit on their federal taxes for the next 10 years. And that's the real basics of how the program work. And what we do is we commit to that 15 years of affordability. And what Montana does is further require us, if we were to use these credits for 40, we all check the box that we're going to do this for 46 years. So the deed restriction that I talked about, and deed restricted, means that even if I go away or Tracy goes away or Geoff, that project remains in the program and is deed restricted affordable. So that's why I use that term, but the rent restricted is the program itself targets between 40 and 60% area median income. There's a term you may hear that's income averaging, and it's new to the IRS. We're all thrilled about it because it basically takes that bandwidth and widens it a little bit. And we can go up to 70 and sometimes 80% area median income with the offset of a lower 40% or 30% unit. I'm not going to go any further on that, but what it does is more compliance, but it reaches a little bit more of that bandwidth that we were talking about. Those residents that apply to move in, they have to income qualify. We go through a very tedious process with the property management company and all the partners. You have to qualify. Once you've moved in, qualified to your different rent restrictions, you get to stay there for as long as you want once you've qualified. And the households are very specific. And so that's a really general low-income housing tax credit project. There's also a 4% tax credit. Larkspur in your community was a project that Homeword partnered with a for-profit developer. And because you have such a high rent ability in the tax credit program, because your overall incomes are higher, we were able to do that with a 4% tax credit, non-competitive. We're not fighting with each other at the state for these funds, but it only covers about 40% of the total project costs, where then you have to borrow the money to do the rest. It has to be a larger scale like Larkspur, and my congrats to HRDC, because my understanding is they just closed their 4% project there, which is not simple, so well done. But so those are some of the very specific IRS programs, but then we start to talk about the other money that we need to throw into the kitty to make these things work, because there's nothing worse than having construction costs go through the roof, labor costs go, materials go through the roof, and then tax credit pricing to go down. We're kind of in a weird place right now in the program, but what we normally would do, and what we definitely do now, is we layer in different programs. HUD has a new construction resource called HOME. It's not an acronym, it's just called HOME, and it's allocated to the state, each state, similar to the IRS program. And there's also 3 cities in Montana, Missoula, Billings, and Great Falls, that get their own allocation of home funds. It's very small, but they're jurisdictions. That is a federal resource, and that targets very similar targeted deed restricted area median income targets. And so it's for new construction and can be put into a tax credit project, as we call it a soft source, but we would be granted it and we would loan it into the partnership and make the project work. It's usually, maybe $500,000, could be up to $1 million in funds typically, and most of the time smaller than that. So it's just a little bit to help you get, and it has some other things in the program, but I won't go into that today. The Housing Trust Fund was actually something that got created, and it's not a federal resource, even though it's administered by the same program at the Department of Commerce here in Montana. It was settlement funds, long story, and they went out and basically, if we apply to use Housing Trust Fund money and put it into a project, so many of those homes within that project will be targeted at 30% area median income. And the compliance on that program is 30 years. We have to maintain the rents and only charge dictated rents through the program based on census data and income targets. 30% area median income, 30 years. Home is 20 years or 15, depending on the activity. Federal Home Loan Bank is actually through the Federal Home Loan Bank system. It's actually the affordable housing program. In rental housing specifically, they have many programs. They have first-time homebuyer assistance. There's some other things. But in rental, you can use it for new construction or preservation. I should say that on all of these. Preservation of homes or new construction. They have different deed restrictions. They're very similar, but again, they go up to about 60% area median income, and they usually are they're very competitive. We in Montana apply in the majority of the country, and Federal Home Loan Bank of St. Louis can apply for it, and they usually are put into preservation projects or projects using historic buildings. There's just a point system in which we compete. The Livingston Memorial Hospital, where I am now, was awarded to Homeword and HRDC. We were able to get some funds for this project here because of the nature of the project. But it again has deed restrictions that go, I'm going to misspeak, it's either 15 or 20 years. I think it's 15 from a compliance period standpoint, a little less stringent than the HUD programs. CDBG is Community Development Block Grant. The Community Development Block Grant is also a HUD program allocated to the state and then also allocated to 4 jurisdictions in Montana. I'm going to misspeak on that. I can't remember. Missoula gets some, Great Falls gets some, and I think Bozeman gets some, don't they, Tracy? I can't remember. Do
No,
you
we
know
don't.
anymore? Okay.
Billings, we don't.
Billings?
It's just Billings, Great Falls,
3?
and Missoula.
Okay.
We've never
Yeah.
gotten it. Too
I
small.
thought for some reason, yeah, I don't know. It just makes me laugh because
Yep, too tiny.
yeah, but not really, as we know, because you guys have one of
Right.
the biggest issues in the state. So, and that opens the door that Bozeman projects can apply. And they are very specific dollars. You can use them for land acquisition, infrastructure, public infrastructure, and a few other very specific things, but they can be put into the housing projects that pay for very specific things within the project itself. I would say that's a very general statement, but there's lots of compliance with all of these things. And what's unique and has been for a very long time is that, and Bozeman was the leader, Bozeman actually set aside general fund money. They had a mill levy, they've done this, and you actually have, and I don't know if you call it a housing trust fund, but you've been setting aside money annually for a long time, and you are one of the critical resources that can go into projects in the Bozeman community. And we are working in Missoula on that. We have an unfunded housing trust fund, but we're getting really creative and pulling money out of city pots for sidewalks and other things. And so when we talk about housing policy and a lot of the pieces that you all work on as a community, those targets where Tracy talked about going up to 80%, all the communities in Montana have an issue, whether we have a lack of housing stock or we have income bandwidths or a really thriving market like Whitefish or Livingston or Bozeman, where it's just impossible to find a home. And so the equation, that's the way I talk about it, really is it's the same equation. There's just little different pressure points in different communities. And so the city of Whitefish has a very generous housing policy. They have an urgent need. They target up to 150% area median income. Missoula has come out with a new policy, and we're targeted up to 120% area median income, because what we are fighting for is that bandwidth right above the rent restricted. All of these programs are targeted to lower incomes, mid to lower. Well, there's a huge bandwidth, and you can see that from Tracy's illustration between rent restricted and market. And so we're trying to find that work in that missing middle. And so there's some details we could go into if you guys have questions about that. But I'll stick to the script on the rent restricted and say that we can use and resyndicate or syndicate existing projects with project-based vouchers. Geoff mentioned it. It has to, if we're using low-income housing tax credits to do that, we have to have a 15-year contract to guarantee it for that private investor. And then they leave after the 15 years, and typically we'll take ownership in full as the general partner, or be first right of refusal for another nonprofit or a partner in that project. And so you have to have that guarantee to get those project-based and to preserve it. And it's usually a lot of those project-based subsidies are in projects that haven't been able to afford the proper rehab for a long time. And so it takes a lot of equity to throw in to make them stable to last the next, you'd say 15 years, but the next 20 to 30 years without a major rehab. And so I talked about the competitive nature of that 9% to say we don't have enough resources. Those 5 projects that get funded every year in the low-income housing tax credit are a mix of preservation and new construction and subsidy preservation, the projects, the subsidized. And it's just going to continue to get worse because we need to build new units and preserve. And so we're just going to keep competing against ourselves. And so if we get to a point where we can, and you guys hear about a state housing credit, I would advocate that you support that, because it's a resource that the state can do that's similar and compare with these programs, and we can produce more. But that's just my pitch on the state housing credit we're working on at the legislature. So, and again, I'll point out at the end there, preservation is important, but the subsidy preservation is absolutely critical. All right, Tracy, go for it.
Okay, thanks. I think I maybe assigned the slide to Geoff, but I can't remember. I think I did, right? Geoff, do you want to talk a little bit about the Boulevards in Darlington?
Yeah, so obviously we've discussed the subsidies on both of those. So we referenced the 4% or 9% tax credit. This is a 4% tax credit and tax exempt bond transaction. So it is not competitive. You meet the requirements and you get the bonds and therefore the credits. Some of the difficulties here, and as you all are aware, I think the city of Bozeman has contributed or is going to contribute $500,000, and then there's also a housing trust fund allocated to the property. But obviously with COVID and the pandemic and the equity market and a multitude of other factors, that 4% tax credit, the equity being received for these projects has gone down. So with HTF and the city of Bozeman money estimated the critical gap to fill for these projects. So basically, we expect to close soon on this and then start construction over the next year on both of these projects. And I think, as everybody's aware, the price and for Boulevard and construction is significant now. So any dollar received to the properties is critical. The Boulevard is that one that has the annual contract, and that gets renewed every year. So that is being converted, as I mentioned, through the rental assistance demonstration RAD 2 process to a 20-year half contract. And with that comes the long-term use restrictions and deed restrictions. The same restrictions will be put on Darlington as well. We will go to the 55-year LIHTC use restriction, as well as the necessary HUD restrictions as well. So it really shores up the long-term affordability. And from a scope of work standpoint, we're doing everything to set these properties up for success over the next 20 years. And obviously there's maintenance that needs to be done, but from systems and roof and everything else, we're bringing these up to date, and it'll be better for the residents and the properties in the long term.
Thanks, Geoff. So I should note that the photo that is included is an interior shot of the Boulevards. So it, as you can see, does require a small amount of updating. That might be an original sync. It's certainly dated. And then at the bottom here, I just noted that we constantly are watching out for LIHTC properties in the community that are maybe completing, this program is old, and there are projects that are completing their affordability restrictions. This longer term restriction that Heather had referred to of 46 years, that's a fairly recent development for the state of Montana. So many of these projects have gone out at 20 years and or 15 years even after they've completed their initial affordability periods. So this is something that, we've all been, I know Heather and Geoff and I talk a lot about this, when a property comes up that is a LIHTC development, what is the ability to come in and preserve it? Castle Bar is one that's recently come up that's been for sale. Bridger Peaks is another that is out for sale right now. So this is just something that, we try to keep track of and get an idea of what is out there. Aspen Meadows is an example of one that went out of the program. And I think in this type of market, we're faced with a lot of competing priorities, of course. So when I have to think about, we have limited funds, and do we preserve something with subsidy, or do we preserve a LIHTC development? We have to prioritize preservation of the subsidized development. In an ideal world, we would be able to preserve all of it, but there is a hierarchy, as Heather spoke to, and but it is something that we do keep track of within the community. And I think that something we haven't talked about at all today, but something that obviously has impacts on this housing market is, just the stock of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing in our community. And that's a lot of times just housing that has, maybe it's older, maybe it's a little bit lower quality, and so has always served folks who have lower incomes and the loss of that housing in our community is kind of a further piece that is piling on to all of this. So, you know, every time you lose a mobile home park, for instance,
Yep.
that has a real impact. So that's not even today's subject, but you know, there is a hierarchy in what we are trying to preserve within the community, and unfortunately, we will not likely ever have the resources to preserve it all. Okay, and I'm going to talk just briefly about new stuff that's happening. Obviously, I've said we work really hard to preserve, and as Heather pointed out, you know, it's not enough to preserve what we have. We know that all of the communities we work in still have a lot of needs in excess of what we have available now. So we're all still working very hard to build new housing to serve our communities. Some things that are happening in Bozeman specifically, Timber Ridge is a senior development. It's being developed by Summit Housing Partnership. HRDC is a partner on that. That is, I think, underway right now, kind of through the infrastructure process. And as Heather alluded to, Arrowleaf Park and Perennial Park, these are actually sister projects that HRDC is doing in partnership with GMD, who is the developer of the Larkspur development. Arrowleaf is a family development, and Perennial Park is an elderly focused development. And the really exciting thing about this is in addition to providing over 200 new homes for our community, it will also provide a new facility for Family Promise, which will have an early childhood education center on the site, on the Arrowleaf Park side, actually. And community health partners will be building a new medical and dental clinic on that site as well, on the elderly side. So really exciting community project, just undergoing infrastructure improvements there as well. And then, you know, we talked a lot about LIHTC today, but there are other things, right? And there are other ways that housing gets built. And so one of the programs that I'm working on right now is Housing First Village. That's going to be a supportive housing development. I wanted to mention, and there are others like these in the mix, but Cottonwood and Ida is one that is going to be providing affordable rental homes as part of their planned unit development application. And there's another program that produces affordable homes, and that's called the New Market Tax Credit Program. And so that's slightly different than the low income housing tax credit, and it slightly targets slightly different areas. But there are numerous developers of new market projects that are, you know, talking about how they might be able to include affordable homes as part of that. So there are, other than, you know, LIHTC, which is sort of, I think, the, you know, the elephant that sort of drives everything, there are some other programs that come along to support that development. I just wanted to add a few resources here that where you can go to get more information, because I think we recognize that this is a really big topic, and you could spend a lot of time and jump down a lot of rabbit holes, but these are some places that have some great information. And I do want to do a quick plug for the City of Bozeman's new community housing dashboard, which I think also provides some great information and perspective, and does have links as well to both the housing needs assessment and the city's community housing plan. I think with that, unless Geoff or Heather, you have any comments on things I definitely or obviously missed, I think we might be able to open up for questions.
No, I think we should give time for questions. It's great.
Okay.
So far, we have one question. Let's see, can you move the line up a little bit, Danny? I'm not sure. It says, is there any indication that a new administration will increase HUD or LIHTC project funding?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm cautiously optimistic. One little tiny help would be to fix the 4% tax credit. I'm sure Geoff feels the same way, and it's sitting on somebody's desk in Washington right now as part of the infrastructure bill that's passing. It's the first time I've ever counted on a federal change that could considerably help housing production in general. I would say we have seen an ebb and flow of increase and decrease depending on administration. With HUD or the CDBG and the home programs that we talked about have gone up and down, but never really a lot of new resources. We would love to see them double the amount of low-income housing tax credits that can come to Montana. That was something that was talked about during the Obama administration, but it's just not come to fruition yet. It's very, very difficult. It's tax credits are a challenge, but I think one of the other questions that popped through, what would help us most in Montana, I believe, are doing what like Bozeman's doing and setting aside money. But it's not just money, it's also land use policy, infrastructure, all of those things that could help with housing types, because we're talking about a specific bandwidth, but the overall equation, we just need more housing types, especially in a community like Bozeman. And so that's, I think, another big area in which we could have housing production. But one of the questions that came through, and tell me if I don't answer this, is there's a state housing credit proposed. And what it would do, it would behave the same way a federal low-income housing tax credit works. And it would provide, we would sell it to an investor in Montana. They had to be a very specific investor that would get a tax deduction on their state tax credits. And it could pair with the low-income housing tax credit to help take from, we've run models and we are working on policy, because we've run models to where I said that with that very small amount that we get from the state on the 9%, and you pair it with the ability to then increase 4% production, we could double the housing production in Montana every year. And that's still barely what we need to touch statewide, but it would be a huge help. And it's a hard conversation to have because you're offsetting taxes and that's revenue for the state. And so that's one thing that you could spend some more time getting educated about, and the Housing Coalition and HRD is part of that as well. Would love to answer questions about that or have you engaged, especially if you're not in the housing world like us. We need everybody involved in that conversation.
I'm going to run through each question. The next one is: a common cited problem affecting affordability is Bozeman's lack of revenue sources outside of property taxes. Can you speak to Bozeman's specific issues exacerbating the affordability crisis?
I think that, lack of revenue streams is something that we see in lots of Montana communities. So, of course, I can speak to, Bozeman and Livingston and, the communities where, we're doing work in Big Sky, and yeah, they have a $6 million resort tax fund. That certainly makes putting a couple $1 million into workforce housing a lot easier, and it's a less restricted funding source than, say, the low-income housing tax credit or home or CDBG. So I do think that we don't have the same funding streams, right? And we don't have, we're not a HUD entitlement community, so we're not picking up, and I know those amounts aren't huge. But they are a reliable stream of funds that you can count on coming into your community and you can activate towards meeting your needs. So I do think that becoming an entitlement community does hold some promise for some new things that we will at least be able to have a reliable stream. I think at the same time, as our community has grown, our needs have just exploded. So that's the flip side of the growth, right? Right. So I don't know that I fully answered that question. I think that, diversity in funding streams would obviously be very welcome. But I think that that's also a statewide, that's some statewide policy. That's not necessarily Bozeman going to fix that one.
Yeah. And I'll throw in a little bit. It's a very hard question to answer because there are competing needs. I mean, their schools need things. The communities needs things. One of the approaches that we've taken to help, because every penny counts to make these projects work and to spread the limited resources we do have, it's around land use policy, zoning, incentives built in. Every community can do a little bit a help there. One of the policies that we're moving forward in Missoula, because we have a new housing office, it's been up and running for over a year now, and they're focused. We have a project very similar to Arrowleaf and Perennial that's as complicated, and why I keep saying congrats to HRDC is that we're working with the Housing Authority and Blue Line Development. There's 3 of us working on this a project similar in nature and using the low-income housing tax credit program. But we're asking the city to, in the 4%, we're asking the city resources that they wouldn't typically think about. And with the housing policy and the office, we're using this project as a testing ground. And so we're literally, there's one area in which we can use city sidewalk money and city road money will help with like $100,000 that they already had budgeted to do work in this area. We're going to spend it on our project, and we're going to put it into our project. Money to us, we'll build it. And then we'll leverage it into the tax credit project and generate a little bit of additional equity to help with the project. Similarly, we've used TIF money, tax increment financing, as a very valuable resource, and in Montana, assist deed restricted affordable homes in their development. And so we've worked with MRA, Missoula Redevelopment Agency, and on a past project, and they bought land for us and sold it back to us for half price using the TIF money to write it down. And that was super helpful because the one thing in a tax credit project is I need land to make the project work, but it's useless to me in the tax credit structure. I can't generate tax basis that generates our credit requests. So helping with the land is very significant, and then also leverages the AHP funds and those talked about other things. So it's really about putting that mix together and trying to leverage other resources and think creatively. And I think land use, townhome exemption. I know you guys don't use that in Missoula or Bozeman, and I know why. It was abused, but it is something we've been carefully crafting and working on in Missoula to help with the ability to do some things on certain pieces of land for affordability. So it's a delicate subject, but there's some other areas that could be considered that might be helpful instead of just straight cash. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, and Geoff, I would ask if, you're working around the country, are there resources that you're like, gosh, I really wish we had that in Bozeman. I really wish we had that available in Montana.
Well, yeah, but a lot of these larger cities have their own city or county subsidy programs. So obviously that would be, just the whole Section 8 discussion. But I think there would be interesting ways of dealing with that or trying to figure something out where it might not get the amount of subsidy as a Section 8 contract over time, but could you, bridge a little bit of the gap so you can raise those rents, get a little more debt, and then make the budgets work. But I think, the fixed 4%, which we don't need to delve into that on the federal side, but then the 4% Montana credit would be huge in terms of getting, increasing the new construction and preservation. But I think it's that, you're taking away those 9% for some of these, and it would really boost the number of units coming online.
I just call the fixed 4% the chupacabra of the affordable housing world. So sorry, I've been promised this for a long time. So I know.
I said I was cautiously optimistic, but I don't trust the feds either. So
I know. We've been talking about this for too long.
I would say there's one resource, and we just passed it, and it's not targeted now, but maybe if we show some ground. My colleagues in Colorado and other places, I just call it weed money. They get their money, the money generated from the sale of marijuana legally goes into a base, and they use it basically in a housing trust fund, and they assist projects, millions of dollars go into projects to make that work. And it's something long game in Montana. I think what recently passed is targeted at, to veterans and seniors in a few very key targeted areas. But it could be something that could open up down the road and help with investment in building affordable homes.
The next question on our list is, clearly there is considerable housing, especially cost attainable housing. Is that right? Are you reading that right? Okay. What community have you seen address the greatest percentage of housing need, and what percentage was that? I think there might be a word missing, housing need, yeah.
So it's a good question. I think I understand the question. Like, which community has done the most and being able to hit the broadest targets? I always, is that okay? So I would say I've always touted Bozeman. I know that you guys are working on it and you feel like you're behind, but the fact the general fund money was set aside so early with work on HRDC side, I think that's a huge success and you're able to help. But and where it happens, there are places like Whitefish I mentioned. They have a much larger target. They're like a Big Sky, but in a smaller little pocket, but they don't have the resources, but their policy goes up to 150% area median income. And they will prioritize as TIF and everything to throw at a project to make it work. We're completing one up there now that was a dream to work with that community, but land is an issue, and the cost of that land, we had to have a buyer that was willing to sell it for less. And so, but that was specifically a low-income housing tax credit project, but they're working on what's called the snow lot. We helped consult with them. They had city land that they were prioritizing and wanted to do, hit those higher targets of home ownership, up to 80 to 120% or 80 up to 150% area median income. So I think that from my experience, they're doing a lot. Billings has a lot of really good policy threaded through their zoning from land use and those pieces. Yeah, I don't think I'm answering the question, but I think we're all struggling with it, the equation in general.
I would say that, some of the difficulty in probably answering that question is that when you're thinking about snapshots in time, right? And snapshots in time are like probably the closest I ever saw Bozeman come to really being able to resolve housing affordability problems was right after the recession. Everything was cheap and everyone was employed. Well, that's a snapshot in time that, it's like, gosh, it would have been great had we been able to capture some of that at the time. But I think that, those are, when I look at, 2007 Bozeman or 2008 Bozeman was doing a really great job of addressing housing affordability. But we're not in that time frame anymore. So I think that you can't necessarily compare our successes and progress to that snapshot in time. We have to, there are so many externalities that we don't get to control. So I think that it's important to try to figure out, well, what are the levers that we do have control over? And, I think Heather pointed out, right, like land use is a lever that we actually do control. We don't necessarily have control over, community growth, and how many people move to a community, but focusing on what you can control makes more sense.
Well, and I would say, I mean, I was really optimistic the last couple of years of people understanding how housing is infrastructure, having a safe roof over your head, factors into so many things, and people recognized how important that was to economic development. And so everybody gets it, right? It's not just us saying, hey, people need roofs over their head. So we had a lot of momentum there, and now we're in a world of COVID where you have materials and labor through the roof and credit pricing. When we say that, nobody needs a tax credit, so the amount we can get for the projects way up. And so it's just making things, again, snapshot in time, very difficult. And so it'll be interesting to see how we come out of this current environment. But I know you all are hit, and we are as well in a lot of communities with our housing stock being depleted, meaning people are just, it's not a false thing. People are coming and buying homes for cash that never have to, they'll telework, for Twitter. That sounds funny, but it's true. It's happening in Lewistown. It's happening in Missoula. We've had real cases where the housing stock that was already limited is now compounded. So that's adding another dynamic. So these are all just things that we keep our thumb on the pulse and talk about and try to work around and navigate, control what you can control, right?
Do you have any, with your national work, do you have any examples of other cities or communities our size even that may have gone before us and done a good job of addressing housing needs. Maybe it's increasing stock, maybe it's figuring out a reliable funding source. Yeah, do you have any community examples that we could maybe look to? Land use policies?
I'm trying to think. I don't so much have specific examples of cities, you know, of comparable size. I think to Tracy and Heather's point, obviously this is constantly evolving in terms of the needs, and you know, you focus on one solution of is it homelessness, and how do you know, mitigate and bring project-based homeless properties online so that you can help that process. But and then there's another issue with, you know, the middle income or the, you know, 60 to 80% AMI. So I think it's just so broad that there's no singular answer to that question. But I think, you know, obviously Bozeman's prioritizing, and I think it's just about the resources available to various cities and what they can think, financial and otherwise, as you're talking land use and infrastructure and TIF. So I think it's just keep coming up with ideas and working through those in specific examples and trying to, you know, bring certain projects to fruition as opposed to just a blanket push.
Okay. And I think we have one more question and about 6 minutes left. If anybody in the participant audience has any questions, enter them now in the Q&A box. Otherwise, for our panelists, we have a follow-up question to one asked earlier. Heather spoke about an initiative at the state legislature. How can we channel energy and activism, especially passionate young persons who are struggling, to effectively lobby for change?
Great question. I would say join the Housing Coalition and ask those questions. There's a very broad group of people working on that, and our organizations are part of that, but we're part of a larger collective. And I think reach out to Tracy, reach out to myself, and we'll get you contacted so that you can get to the right people and participate. And then we do need to get organized, and we are working on those components right now.
And I should note that the city has actually joined Montana Housing Coalition as well. City of Bozeman.
I should have said that. City of Bozeman called and asked, and we're like, yes, it's fantastic.
Which is really exciting. So that's, I think that there's a lot of great places to get involved.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't see any questions coming through. Do you see any, Danny, coming in the chat? If that's it, I want to really thank each of you for presenting and answering questions for us today. I think this is the beginning of a longer discussion and a broader discussion over time. But I, for one, appreciate a little bit of, you know, basic education. Everybody needs a 101 sometimes. Any parting words from any of you all? Otherwise, we'll let you all go for the day.
Well, I think Marty did have a great follow-up question. So, you know, and I would agree. It was, how did the city get such a good housing manager and neighborhoods coordinator? And I would also add, our city has an amazing community development director in Marty Madsen, who has been a really, really good friend of affordable housing. So.
Yeah, and I'd say
thanks, everybody.
Marty. Hey, to our speakers, would you guys mind putting your email addresses and names just in the chat box, maybe, so folks can copy paste and have those on hand if needed?
I will if I can.
Yeah, if you can find it, there's that chat button on the lower right. And we've also recorded the majority of this session. I spaced pressing record right from the get-go, but we will make that available on the city website, on the community housing website for folks, as well as any other resources that we get from our speakers today.
Tracy, would you be willing to share the slide deck that you made? Would that be okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
The only parting words I'd have to say are thank you guys for participating and wanting to know more. So happy to participate. It's very important that we are all in the dialogue together.
Thanks so much, you all.
I'll reiterate that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye.